What made you call in a favor you swore you'd never use? My 6-year-old daughter Pia came back from her dad's house with chunks of hair missing. I found her in the bathroom at 3 a.m. with safety scissors, cutting more off. When I grabbed the scissors, she whispered, "Daddy's friends choose one girl for the basement. I have to be the ugly one or they'll take me." She was shaking so hard she threw up. I called him begging for answers. "You're insane," he said calmly. "I'm documenting this call. The judge will love hearing how you're filling Pia's head with sick fantasies." The custody threat. And 2 days later, I got my proof. Because that's when Jasmine came over. Jasmine was one of my ex's 7 daughters that he had with 5 different women, all with weekend custody arrangements. And she came over with chunks of hair missing. Her mom mentioned Jasmine kept saying Pia saved me, but wouldn't explain what that meant. That's when I realized this wasn't isolated to my daughter. I called every parent whose daughter visited my ex's house. 4 other girls had cut their hair in the past 2 months. One mom said her daughter kept a notebook tracking whose turn it was for basement time. Another found her 6-year-old practicing making herself ugly with markers on her face at 2 a.m., 4 days until Pia's next visit. My ex's girlfriend sent me a text. "Your daughter is teaching bad habits to the younger ones. Now none of them are suitable. This needs to stop." The word suitable made my skin crawl. I went to CPS with photos of the girls' destroyed hair and statements from 5 mothers. The caseworker said children cut their hair all the time, and without evidence of physical abuse, they couldn't investigate. She actually wrote in her notes that I appeared to be coaching my daughter. 3 days wasted. One mother, Elizabeth, was my last hope. Her daughter Emily used to have the prettiest hair of all the girls, long blonde and past her waist. Emily got picked for the basement 2 months ago and hadn't been the same since. She slept under her bed, wouldn't let anyone bathe her, and drew pictures of stairs going down into darkness. Elizabeth looked broken when she told me Emily still had the hair she cut off saved in a box under her bed labeled before. I had 3 days left and tried the police again. The officer actually smirked. "Little girls playing hairdresser isn't a crime, ma'am. Maybe focus on being a better co-parent?" He slid the photos back without looking. "Besides, your ex already called. Said you might come in with wild stories." That night, Pia stood at the mirror touching the small amount of regrowth. "It's getting pretty again," she said matter-of-factly. "I'll have to go down next time." My phone buzzed. It was my lawyer. I begged him to tell the judge I was sick, in an accident, detained, any lie that would let me keep her home Friday. He stayed silent until I finished crying to say the words that broke me. If I didn't send Pia for her visit, I'd lose custody permanently. I had 24 hours to decide between contempt of court or sending my daughter back to that house. Pia gave me Jasmine's hair ribbon at breakfast. My hair grew back too fast last time. Jasmine had to go instead. The guilt in her 6-year-old voice broke me. 1 hour left and Pia gripped my hand in the car. What if I can't make myself ugly enough this time? When we pulled into his driveway, 2 other cars were already there. Selena climbed out first, 5 years old with blonde curls to her waist. Then Eve, 7 with beautiful dark hair. Pia saw them and started screaming. "Not them! They're too pretty!" I just smiled. Because I wasn't just dropping Pia off tonight. I was getting into that basement. I called my cousin Pedro, ex-military police. "Remember what Uncle Larry did to us? He didn't need more. Give me 20 minutes. The other mothers were walking their daughters to the door. Pedro arrived with his brother Jose. They'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan together. Knew how to make people talk. My ex came out smiling, ready to gloat about custody. But his face changed when he saw Pedro. "Get inside," Pedro said quietly. The other mothers held their daughters back as we followed him in. His girlfriend tried to run. Jose caught her in the kitchen, zip-tied to a chair in seconds. My ex backed against the wall. "This is kidnapping. You just lost custody forever. Where's the basement?" I cut him off. Pedro already found it. 3 locks, just like the neighbor said. He had them picked in under a minute. My ex went white. "You can't go down there. Please. You don't understand. The pretty ones go down." I was recording everything. 1 girl every weekend. Pia tried to save them by cutting her hair. I moved toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I went down into the darkness. Cold air wrapped around me, and I could see my breath in little puffs. A single bulb hung from a wire in the middle of the ceiling. It swayed back and forth, throwing crazy shadows on the gray concrete walls. My phone shook in my hand, but I kept recording everything. The smell hit me first, like old gym socks mixed with something sour that made my stomach flip. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped and stared at what they'd set up down here. A tripod stood in the corner with a video camera pointed at a small mattress on the floor. The mattress had stains on it and no sheets. SD cards were scattered across a wooden table next to the tripod. 4 metal rings were bolted into the walls at different heights with rope coiled next to each one. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to walk closer and film every detail. Pedro called down from the top of the stairs asking if I was okay. I managed to say yes, even though my whole body was shaking. I needed to document everything before the police got here. My ex started yelling from upstairs about lawsuits and kidnapping charges and how we'd all go to jail. His voice sounded scared now instead of angry. I ignored him and kept filming the basement setup. On the table next to the SD cards, I found a notebook with a pink cover. Inside were dates going back months with different initials next to each date. PP for Pia appeared a lot at first, but less after 2 months ago. JM for Jasmine showed up more recently. ER had the most marks next to her initials. Emily Rose from Elizabeth's descriptions. The pattern made me want to throw up. Each weekend, one set of initials got marked. The pretty ones went down just like Pia said. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the notebook, but I filmed every page. Jose was keeping my ex and his girlfriend tied up in the kitchen while I searched for more evidence. A metal cabinet sat against the far wall with a padlock on it. I called Pedro down and he had it picked in 30 seconds. Inside were more SD cards in plastic cases with dates written on labels. 2 years worth of weekend dates. Pedro's face went white when he saw how many there were. We both knew what these probably showed. The girlfriend started screaming from upstairs that we didn't understand anything. She yelled that the girls needed to learn humility and respect, and that's all this was about. Her voice got higher as she insisted they were teaching the girls their place in the world. I ran back up the stairs with my phone still recording to catch her words. She kept going even when she saw me filming. She said the pretty ones got too much attention and needed to be brought down. She said it built character. My ex told her to shut up, but she kept screaming about how the girls needed to learn. I got it all on video. My hand stopped shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered and I told her we'd found a locked basement with evidence of child abuse. She asked if anyone was hurt, and I explained about the girls cutting their hair and the basement setup. I gave her the address and she said units were on the way. She told me not to touch anything else, but I'd already touched plenty. The other mothers had gathered their daughters outside by their cars. I went out and asked the neighbor lady to come look at what we'd found. She was maybe 70 years old with gray hair and curlers. She said she'd heard crying from the house sometimes, but figured it was just kids being kids. When she saw the basement, her hand went to her mouth. She kept saying, "Oh my God," over and over. She said she'd testify to whatever we needed. 2 patrol cars pulled up with lights flashing but no sirens. The officers got out slow like this wasn't urgent. They saw Pedro and Jose standing guard and immediately got defensive. One officer said we could face charges for unlawful entry and restraint. Pedro stayed calm and explained we'd prevented imminent harm to children. The officer said that wasn't for us to decide. They wanted to arrest Pedro and Jose right there, but Pedro kept his cool. He showed them the basement and suddenly they stopped talking about arresting anyone. One officer called for backup while the others started taking pictures. 20 minutes later, an unmarked car pulled up and Detective John Curry got out. He was maybe 50 with gray hair and moved like he'd seen everything. He turned on his body camera right away and started separating everyone for statements. He told the patrol officers to secure the scene and keep everyone separated. His whole manner changed when he saw the basement. He stopped being skeptical and started being thorough. He asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning while his camera recorded. I showed him the notebook with the schedule and the cabinet full of SD cards. He bagged everything as evidence and called for a forensics team. He said this would be handled right, and I actually believed him. Detective Curry pulled out his phone and made a call to the Child Advocacy Center, while the patrol officers kept everyone separated. He explained we needed trained interviewers for the girls, because any contaminated statements could destroy the whole case in court. I handed him my phone with all the videos I'd recorded of the basement, and the girlfriend's screaming confession about teaching the girls their place. My ex started in again about how I was crazy and filling Pia's head with sick ideas, and reminded everyone he'd already called the police about my mental state weeks ago. Detective Curry listened without any expression on his face, then asked my ex to explain why there were 3 locks on the basement door if nothing bad was happening down there. My ex's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. The detective went back down to the basement with his camera and started documenting everything while calling for a forensics team to come process the scene. He put on gloves and carefully bagged each SD card as evidence and took photos of the mattress and the anchor points in the walls and the tripod setup. His partner started talking to the other mothers who were still outside with their daughters and taking notes about when each girl had started cutting her hair and what other behavior changes they'd noticed. One of the patrol officers mentioned that Pedro and Jose could face charges for unlawful restraint since they'd zip-tied my ex and his girlfriend. Detective Curry looked up from bagging evidence and said they'd prevented ongoing child endangerment using minimal force, and the discussion should focus on getting everyone's official statements instead of arresting the people who'd stopped this. About 40 minutes later, a woman in a gray suit showed up and introduced herself as Marta Price from CPS. She took one look at the basement setup and the evidence bags and immediately approved an emergency protective hold on all 7 girls. She was mad that a previous complaint had been closed without proper investigation and kept shaking her head while reading through the old case file on her tablet. She made it clear none of the girls would be going back to their father's house tonight or any night until this was fully investigated. 2 vans from the Advocacy Center arrived to transport the children for forensic interviews with their specialist, Isabel Rose. I was scared about what Pia would have to describe, but knew she needed to tell trained professionals who could document everything properly for court. The other mothers and I got in our own cars to follow the vans while the police stayed to continue processing the scene. Detective Curry asked me to come to the station to give my formal statement about why I'd entered the house without permission. He said I might get a trespass citation, but he understood my position as a mother trying to protect her child and advised me to cooperate fully with everything going forward. Pedro and Jose had to show their IDs and explain their military background to the officers. They agreed to stay available as witnesses. and understood they might face misdemeanor charges for the restraint, even though they'd been trying to help. I felt bad for dragging them into this mess, but Pedro just squeezed my shoulder and said, "Family protects family, no matter what." The girlfriend started trying to minimize everything while still zip-tied to the chair. She claimed they were just teaching the girls to be modest and not vain about their looks. She admitted the word suitable in her text meant teaching them humility through basement time, but insisted it was all about building character and respect. Every word out of her mouth made things worse for them, and Detective Curry recorded all of it on his body camera. He called someone named Sunita Bhatia, who was an assistant district attorney, and explained what we'd found. She approved seeking a telephonic search warrant for the SD cards so they could review the footage immediately, instead of waiting days for a regular warrant. Within an hour, the warrant came through and Detective Curry started reviewing the videos on a laptop in his car. His face got darker and darker with each video he watched. The preliminary footage showed girls crying on the basement stairs, even though there wasn't visible physical abuse happening. The psychological torture was clear in their faces and the way they shook and begged not to go down. Detective Curry said this was more than enough for criminal charges and called the ADA back to discuss next steps. 20 minutes later, Detective Curry had his laptop open in the conference room, reviewing the SD card footage while I sat across from him trying not to throw up. The first video showed Emily standing at the top of the basement stairs crying so hard she couldn't breathe, while my ex's voice said she was chosen for being the prettiest that week. The second video had Jasmine begging not to go down because her stomach hurt, and the girlfriend telling her pretty girls don't complain. Detective Curry's jaw kept getting tighter with each video he clicked through, and after the fifth one he closed the laptop and called the ADA again, saying they had more than enough for multiple felony charges. We walked out to the garage where another officer was taking photos of a huge whiteboard covered in the girls' initials with dates next to them going back 2 years. Every girl who'd cut her hair had their initials circled in red marker with the word unsuitable written next to them starting exactly when they'd destroyed their hair. The schedule showed Emily's initials appearing every other week until 2 months ago, when she started cutting her hair, and then Jasmine's initials replaced hers on the schedule. Detective Curry took close-up photos of everything while calling someone at CPS about a complaint from 14 months ago that got closed without investigation. He found the case number in their system showing a neighbor had reported hearing children crying and screaming from the basement, but the caseworker had marked it as unsubstantiated after my ex told her the kids were just playing too rough. The detective documented everything in his notes and said this pattern of missed warnings would strengthen the criminal case and help with the civil lawsuits that would definitely be coming. One of the other officers came in holding a folder from Emily's school counselor, who just faxed over drawings Emily had made 6 months ago, showing stick figures going down dark stairs with tears on their faces. The counselor's notes said she'd been concerned, but my ex had explained Emily was just processing her parents' divorce and asked them not to contact me about it. Detective Curry added the drawings to the evidence pile and called Ada Bhatia back to update her on everything they'd found so far. Within an hour, she'd filed emergency paperwork with the family court judge for immediate no-contact orders covering all 7 girls, plus requesting an expanded search warrant for my ex's computers and phones to look for more evidence. 2 officers walked my ex out to their patrol car in handcuffs, while he kept yelling about false imprisonment and how his lawyer would destroy all of us in court. The girlfriend got arrested 10 minutes later after trying to convince the officers this was all a misunderstanding about teaching the girls proper values and modesty. Her lawyer showed up before they even got her to the station and started talking about making a deal if she testified about everything she knew. Detective Curry handed me a citation for criminal trespass, but said the DA probably wouldn't pursue it given the circumstances, and that I should focus on cooperating with the investigation going forward. The local news van pulled up just as they were loading my ex into the transport vehicle, and a reporter started asking questions, but I walked straight past her to my car. Elizabeth and the other mothers had already agreed we wouldn't talk to any media until the girls were safe and the criminal case was solid. Pedro and Jose got told they might face misdemeanor charges for the restraint, but Detective Curry put them down as cooperating witnesses who'd helped prevent ongoing child abuse, and they were released without being arrested. Pedro just shrugged when the officer explained the possible charges and said protecting family was worth any price, and he'd do it again tomorrow if needed. The crime scene team spent another 3 hours processing the house, and by the time they finished, they had 12 boxes of evidence, including the camera equipment, SD cards, the schedule board, and even the ropes from the basement walls. Detective Curry said the preliminary review was enough to support charges of child endangerment, unlawful restraint, and conspiracy, but they'd probably add more charges once they reviewed all the digital evidence. My phone kept buzzing with texts from the other mothers asking for updates, and I told them about the arrests and evidence, but asked them to stay quiet about everything until the official charges were filed. The detective gave me his card and said he'd call me the next day with updates about the case, and reminded me again not to do anything that might compromise the prosecution. I drove to the advocacy center to pick up Pia, who'd finished her first interview with Isabel, and looked exhausted, but less scared than she had in weeks. On the way home, she asked if Daddy was going to jail, and I told her the police were handling everything now and she was safe. That night, she slept in her own bed for the first time in a month without waking up screaming about her hair growing back. The next morning, Detective Curry called to say the girlfriend's lawyer had already reached out about a cooperation agreement where she'd testify about the whole system in exchange for reduced charges. He also mentioned that 2 more mothers had come forward after hearing about the arrests with similar stories about their daughters suddenly cutting their hair after weekend visits. The investigation was expanding, and he said this was turning into one of the biggest child abuse cases the county had seen in years. The Advocacy Center called me the next morning to schedule Pia's forensic interview with Isabel Rose for that afternoon. I packed snacks and her favorite stuffed animal, even though they said she'd be in a separate room from me. The building looked like a regular house from outside, with a playground in back and bright paintings in the windows. Isabel met us in the lobby wearing jeans and a sweater instead of a suit, which made Pia relax a little. She showed Pia the interview room with its soft couches and art supplies, while I waited in another room watching through a monitor. For 2 hours, I watched my daughter slowly open up about the basement and the selection process, and how she figured out cutting her hair would make her less pretty. She couldn't say everything and kept drawing instead of talking when Isabel asked about specific weekends. Isabel came out afterward and explained this was normal for trauma victims, and they'd need multiple sessions to get the full picture. She said Pia did amazing for a first interview, and gave me referrals for trauma therapists who specialized in young children. My lawyer called that night saying the emergency protective order hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, and I needed to bring all my documentation. The retainer I'd paid him 3 months ago was already gone, and he needed another $5,000 to continue representing me. I sold my grandmother's jewelry the next morning and pawned my laptop to scrape together $3,000. He said we had a strong case with the arrests and evidence, but warned me the judge might not be happy about my vigilante approach. The courthouse was packed when we arrived for the hearing, with all 7 mothers there with their lawyers. My ex showed up in an orange jumpsuit with his public defender, who kept arguing this was all a misunderstanding about appropriate discipline. The judge reviewed the evidence for 40 minutes, including the basement photos and the schedule board with the girls' initials. She granted extended no-contact orders for all 7 girls and removed them from their father's custody pending the criminal trial. My chest finally loosened enough to take a full breath for the first time in weeks. Then she turned to me with a stern expression and spent 10 minutes lecturing me about taking the law into my own hands. She said I was lucky I wasn't facing kidnapping charges myself, and that citizens can't just restrain people and search their homes. But she acknowledged the system had failed these children when CPS dismissed the initial complaint, and the police refused to investigate. She granted me temporary full custody with CPS monitoring for 6 months to ensure Pia's safety and well-being. It felt humiliating to have a social worker checking on us, but I'd accept anything to keep Pia away from him. Pedro and Jose's arraignment happened the next week, where the prosecutor offered them a deal for disorderly conduct with 40 hours of community service and $500 fines each. They both laughed when they came out of court, saying it was worth it to see my ex's face when they walked through his door. Pedro said family protects family, and he'd do it again tomorrow if needed. I promised to pay their fines as soon as I could, even though my bank account was already empty from legal fees. Detective Curry called me 3 days later with huge news about the girlfriend flipping on my ex. Her lawyer had worked out a cooperation agreement where she'd testify about everything in exchange for reduced charges. She spent 6 hours with the detective describing the beauty ranking system they used for the girls, and how they picked which one went to the basement each weekend. She explained how they'd rate the girls from prettiest to ugliest when they arrived, and the prettiest one had to go downstairs for special time. The detective said even he was shaken by the systematic nature of the psychological abuse that had been going on for 2 years. She also admitted to helping create the schedule and enforcing the rules about which girl's turn it was. Her testimony gave them enough to add conspiracy charges on top of the child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. Sunita Bhatia, the ADA, called me the following week about a plea deal for my ex to avoid putting the girls through testifying at trial. She was offering him 3 years for unlawful imprisonment and child endangerment if he'd plead guilty and avoid trial. Part of me wanted him to rot in prison for decades, but I understood protecting the girls from having to relive everything on the witness stand. She gave him 2 weeks to decide while she continued building the case in case he refused. Meanwhile, Elizabeth started organizing the other mothers into an informal support group, since we were all dealing with traumatized daughters and overwhelming legal bills. We met at her house every Thursday night while someone watched all the kids together in the playroom. We shared therapist recommendations and compared notes on our daughter's recovery and split the cost of pizza. None of us had imagined we'd become friends through something so horrible, but we understood each other in ways nobody else could. Elizabeth found a nonprofit that helped with legal fees for abuse victims, and helped us all apply. The first time Pia met with her trauma therapist, she came out looking exhausted and fell asleep in the car before we got home. The therapist, an older woman who specialized in childhood trauma, said Pia was remarkably resilient for everything she'd endured. But the first few sessions were brutal, with Pia having nightmares every night afterward and crawling into my bed shaking. The therapist said this was part of processing the trauma and would get better with time. But watching my daughter suffer through healing felt almost as bad as the original trauma. We kept going twice a week even when Pia begged not to go back, because the therapist said consistency was crucial for recovery. 3 weeks after the girlfriend testified, my ex's lawyer called Sunita to accept the plea deal. His lawyer had explained he was facing 20 to 30 years if convicted at trial with all the evidence against him. The sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and I felt relief flooding through me that the girls wouldn't have to testify. 6 weeks passed like a blur of therapy appointments and legal meetings before the sentencing hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed with all the mothers clutching tissues while my ex stood in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The judge read through the charges slowly and deliberately, while reviewing the evidence Detective Curry had compiled, including the basement videos and the girlfriend's testimony about their ranking system. My ex's lawyer asked for leniency, citing his lack of prior criminal record, but Sunita shut that down fast by detailing the systematic nature of the psychological torture inflicted on 7 little girls over 2 years. When the judge pronounced 18 months in prison plus 3 years probation, with a permanent ban on unsupervised contact with any minors, including his own daughters, I felt my knees go weak with relief, mixed with anger that it wasn't more. The bailiff cuffed him and led him away, while his parents sat crying in the back row, and I held Pia's drawing of our family without him in it. 2 days after sentencing, Marta Price called to tell me CPS was conducting a full internal review of why my initial complaint got dismissed without proper investigation. She came to my apartment with 2 senior supervisors who took detailed notes about everything the first caseworker had said and done, including her accusation that I was coaching Pia. They admitted systemic failures in their screening process and promised new protocols for evaluating psychological abuse cases, but their apologies felt hollow after everything we'd been through. The supervisor handed me paperwork about filing a formal complaint against the original caseworker, which I filled out that night after Pia finally fell asleep. Elizabeth organized our next support group meeting at her house where we discussed the mountain of legal bills crushing all of us. She'd found a nonprofit that helped abuse victims with legal costs and walked us through the application process while our daughters played in the next room. One mother had already lost her car to pay her lawyer, and another was facing eviction, but we pooled resources to help each other with groceries and gas money. Elizabeth started a fund where people could donate to help with our expenses, and within a week we'd raised enough to keep everyone housed for another month. Pia's twice-weekly therapy sessions were brutal to watch as she worked through the trauma with her therapist drawing pictures and using dolls to show what happened. Some nights she'd wake up screaming about the basement and crawl into my bed shaking, but other nights she slept peacefully in her own room, which the therapist called progress. She still checked her hair length in the mirror every morning, running her fingers through it nervously, but stopped talking about cutting it off. The therapist said this obsessive checking would fade with time and consistency, but watching my daughter struggle with something so basic as her own hair broke my heart daily. Sunita called me about pursuing civil suits against my ex for damages once the criminal case wrapped up. She gave me referrals to civil attorneys who worked on contingency, but I couldn't even think about more legal battles when I was drowning in bills and focusing on getting Pia stable. Maybe someday I'd have the energy to fight for financial compensation, but right now just getting through each day felt like enough. A victim compensation fund coordinator reached out after seeing our case in the news and helped me apply for coverage of therapy costs and legal fees. The application was 20 pages of documentation, but 3 weeks later they approved partial coverage, which meant I could keep Pia in therapy without choosing between that and groceries. All the other mothers got approved too, which lifted a huge weight off our collective shoulders. I met with Pia's school principal and counselor to discuss accommodations without making her feel different from other kids. They implemented a buddy system for bathroom breaks since Pia got anxious being alone in small spaces, and her teacher started watching for signs of distress during the day. Having adults at the school who understood what she'd been through and could support her made such a difference in her ability to focus on learning. One Saturday, Elizabeth brought all the girls to a salon where they decided together to cut their hair short as a way to take back control. What had been forced on them as self-protection became their choice, and they giggled, picking out styles from magazines. Pia surprised me by keeping hers longer, saying she liked it now that nobody could make her cut it, and I watched her smile at herself in the mirror for the first time in months. The local news picked up our story despite our efforts to stay private, and within days my social media filled with horrible messages from strangers calling me a liar and saying I'd destroyed an innocent man's life. Some psycho even found my work email and sent detailed threats about what they'd do to me for ruining a father's relationship with his children. I locked down all my accounts and reported the worst threats to police, but decided fighting anonymous trolls wasn't worth the energy I needed for healing. 3 months after the criminal case ended, I sat in family court for the custody modification hearing, with all our evidence spread across the table. The judge reviewed everything, including the criminal conviction and CPS findings, before granting me sole legal custody permanently, with my ex only eligible for supervised visits if he completed extensive therapy and met a long list of strict conditions. Pia was finally legally protected from him, and I sobbed in the courthouse bathroom afterward from pure exhaustion and relief. 3 weeks later, Pedro texted me a photo from the community center where he and Jose were teaching women's self-defense as part of their plea deal. They had 20 women in the class learning basic moves, and Pedro was grinning in the picture holding up a certificate from the instructor program. Jose stood next to him making bunny ears behind his head like they were kids again. The judge gave them 60 hours each, but they signed up for an extra 40 because they said helping women protect themselves felt like finishing what we started that night. I drove over with coffee and donuts during their break and watched them demonstrate escape techniques to a group of college students. Pedro caught my eye and mouthed, "Worth it," while showing a woman how to break a wrist hold. 6 months passed, and our Tuesday meetings at Elizabeth's house became the one thing I never missed. We'd sit around her kitchen table while the girls played in the backyard and share updates about therapy progress and legal paperwork and which stores had the best deals on kids' clothes. One afternoon, Pia ran inside with grass stains on her knees and her hair flying behind her, asking if she could have a snack. Her hair had grown past her shoulders now, and she'd started wearing it in different styles every day. That weekend, she stood in front of my bathroom mirror, running her fingers through it. "Can I grow it super long like a princess?" I told her she could have any hairstyle she wanted, and she jumped up and down clapping. We went to the mall, and she picked out sparkly hair clips and ribbons, and a special brush with her favorite cartoon character on it. The cashier complimented her beautiful hair, and Pia actually smiled and said thank you instead of hiding behind me. 2 months after that, Elizabeth called crying because her car broke down on the way to Emily's therapy appointment. Within an hour, 3 other moms showed up to help. One drove Elizabeth to the appointment while another arranged a tow truck and I picked up her groceries. We'd become this weird family born from trauma, but held together by something stronger. When one of us struggled, the others just appeared with casseroles or babysitting or sometimes just wine and tissues. My ex's mother called on a Thursday afternoon while I was making dinner. She talked for 20 minutes about how they'd had no idea what was happening, and how sorry they were, and how they still loved Pia. After 3 therapy sessions discussing it, and 2 meetings with the supervision center staff, we agreed to monthly visits. Pia met them at the center with a counselor present, and came home talking about the puzzles they did together. She deserved to know her whole family, even if it had to be through safety glass and supervised interactions. Elizabeth brought Emily over one Saturday with a folder full of drawings from her art therapy sessions. The early ones were all black scribbles and dark stares, but the newer ones had color. She'd drawn all 7 girls as superheroes with capes flying above a house. In another one, they were holding hands in a circle with bright yellow suns above their heads. Emily pointed to each figure and named them, saving Pia for last. "She's the strongest one because she saved us." The therapist called me after Pia's session the following week, saying she was seeing remarkable progress. Pia could identify her feelings now and had developed breathing techniques for when she felt scared. She'd gone from twice weekly sessions to once a week and might move to monthly soon. During pickup, Pia showed me a workbook where she'd drawn herself as a tree with strong roots and branches reaching toward the sun. The Advocacy Center invited us to their annual event, where adult survivors shared their stories. I wasn't sure about taking Pia, but the therapist said it might help her see that healing was possible. We sat in the back row and listened to women talk about building careers and families and lives after trauma. Pia held my hand the whole time, but she was leaning forward listening. Afterward, she asked if those women were superheroes too, and I said yes. During her next therapy session, Pia had what the therapist called a major breakthrough. She'd been carrying guilt about the other girls going to the basement when her hair grew back. The therapist helped her understand that a 6-year-old couldn't protect everyone, and that she'd done something incredible by trying. Pia came out of that session standing taller, and for the first time in months, she didn't check her hair length in the car mirror. A letter came from the Department of Corrections saying my ex was transferred to a facility with a treatment program. His parents told me during their next visit that he'd finally admitted what he did and was starting therapy. I threw the letter in the trash without reading the rest because I didn't care about his journey or his healing or his anything. The only thing that mattered was that he'd be locked up for 18 months and then banned from unsupervised contact with children forever. 3 weeks after that, the district attorney's office called me about creating new rules for cases like ours. Detective Curry was running the training and wanted me to share what signs we saw that everyone missed. I sat in a conference room with 20 detectives while they took notes about haircutting and basement locks and how kids protect each other in ways adults don't understand. They asked specific questions about the timeline, and I walked them through every failed report and dismissed concern. Detective Curry kept shaking his head when I described the CPS worker who said I was coaching Pia. The new protocol they created meant any report of multiple kids showing the same weird behavior would trigger a full investigation. They named it after our case, but I asked them not to use Pia's name. 2 months passed, and Pia was starting 1st grade in September. She walked into that classroom with her backpack and her hair in braids, and nobody knew what she'd been through. The teacher called me after the first week to say Pia was making friends and participating in everything. She sat with 3 other girls at lunch, and they traded snacks and giggled about normal kid stuff. During parent-teacher conferences, the teacher showed me Pia's work and said she was reading above grade level. Her math was strong too, and she loved science experiments. The teacher had no idea about our past, and that was exactly what Pia needed. Just being a regular kid whose biggest worry was spelling tests. When the 1-year mark came around in November, Elizabeth organized something at the park. She rented the big pavilion, and all 7 families showed up with food and drinks. The girls ran around playing tag while we sat at picnic tables watching them. Nobody talked about what happened that night or the months of court stuff after. We just watched our daughters being kids and ate too much potato salad. Jasmine was chasing Pia around the playground, and they were both laughing, so hard they could barely run. Emily had brought sidewalk chalk, and all the girls drew pictures on the concrete. They drew flowers and rainbows and regular kid stuff. Not a single dark staircase in any of the drawings. After the holidays, Elizabeth signed Emily up for a kids' theater program at the community center. Pia begged to join too, so I signed her up. Every Saturday morning, they practiced little plays and learned songs. Pia loved being on stage where she got to pretend to be different characters. The instructor said she had natural stage presence and always knew her lines. For their spring show, they did Peter Pan, and Pia played one of the Lost Boys. She had 3 lines and practiced them constantly at home. When show night came, she said them perfectly, and took her bow with the biggest smile. Around that time, I met someone at the grocery store of all places. We both reached for the same box of cereal and laughed about it. He asked if I wanted to get coffee, and I surprised myself by saying yes. His name was Mark, and he worked construction. I told him about Pia on our second date and about everything that happened. He didn't run away or act weird about it. He just listened and said we were brave. When I introduced him to Pia after a month of dating, she was nervous and quiet. Mark didn't push her to talk or try too hard. He just sat on the floor and built Legos with her while I made dinner. After he left, Pia said he seemed okay, which was huge coming from her. We took things slow, and Mark understood why. 6 months into first grade, Pia came to me with an idea. She wanted to help other kids who were scared to tell grown-ups bad stuff. The Advocacy Center had a program where older kids who'd been through stuff talked to younger kids. Isabel thought Pia was still too young, but we could volunteer together. Once a month, we went to the center and helped set up for the prevention workshops. Pia would hand out coloring pages and sit with kids during snack time. One little girl asked her if monsters were real, and Pia said sometimes people act like monsters, but there are always heroes too. She pointed at me when she said the hero part. The state sent a letter saying the compensation fund approved more money for therapy since the girls were all showing good progress. They admitted the system failed at first, and this was their way of trying to fix it. The extra coverage meant we could keep going to therapy without worrying about the bills. All 7 families got the approval, which helped everyone focus on getting better instead of going broke. Elizabeth brought Emily over more often, and the girls became real friends. Not just trauma bonded, but actual best friends who liked the same movies and books. They had sleepovers where they painted nails and watched Disney movies. One night I checked on them, and they were both asleep in a blanket fort they'd built. Emily's mom and I sat in my kitchen drinking wine and not talking about the past. We talked about school fundraisers and soccer signups and normal mom stuff. 4 months into his sentence, my ex's girlfriend got out. She had to register as a child abuse offender and wear an ankle monitor for a year. The prosecutor called to warn me she was released, but said she was moving to Arizona to live with her sister. We never saw her again, and honestly, I forgot about her pretty quickly. 2 years after that horrible night, I looked around at the summer barbecue Elizabeth organized. All 7 girls were there playing in the sprinklers. Some needed more help than others, but every single one was safe and loved and getting better. Pia's hair was down to her shoulders, and she'd put butterfly clips in it that morning. She was teaching Jasmine a dance routine they'd learned at camp. Emily was drawing with sidewalk chalk again, and Selena was helping her. Eve was reading a book under a tree. The other 2 youngest ones were building sandcastles in the sandbox. We'd done what we had to do to save them, and now they were just being kids. A year later, at our annual family gathering, Pedro stood up with a beer in his hand and made everyone laugh about his community service teaching self-defense. Jose joined him, and they both joked about their criminal records being worth it to see my ex's face that night. Everyone at the party knew the real story, and when Pedro said family protects family, everyone raised their glasses. The other mothers were all there with their daughters who ran around the yard playing tag like regular kids. Elizabeth brought her famous potato salad, and we sat at picnic tables watching our girls just be normal. Pedro and Jose had become the uncles to all 7 girls, and they never missed a birthday or school play. When it got dark, we lit sparklers, and the girls wrote their names in the air with the bright trails. Pia ran over and hugged Pedro around the waist, and he picked her up and spun her around. That night, after everyone went home, I tucked Pia into bed, and her long hair spread across her pillow like silk. She picked out a purple ribbon from her collection and asked me to braid it in tomorrow for school. I checked under her bed out of habit, but there were no scissors hidden there anymore. She fell asleep holding her stuffed unicorn, and I stood in the doorway watching her breathe peacefully. We'd won this fight, and she was finally free to just be a little girl who liked pretty ribbons. Well, folks, that's gonna wrap it up for today. Thanks for letting me wonder about all this with you. It's always interesting sharing these thoughts together. Subscribe for more content like this.